The night Cobb came to my cell and told me all this, I didn't actually move until the following day. Everything these guys did with me was extra. Instead of having the floor officer that worked up there on the tier move me, they had their ERT, emergency response team, move me the next day. So the following day they came up to my door and told me to pack my property, that I was moving. I had already packed the day before, so I told them I'm ready to go, let's do it. South Max was literally on the other side of the wall, so all they had to do was cuff me up, open the door, and then walk me straight onto the tier. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The tier was extremely quiet when we entered. No doubt, since it was an active tier, everybody on the tier knew I was moving over there. Later I'd find out that this was a cool ass tier. Everyone on the tier was solid. There were about 7 Asian cats back there who were all co-defendants, and the rest of the tier were all northerners. They moved me right next door to DB. I don't know if this was by design or if it was just coincidental, but either way, this ended up working out and making things a lot easier. Even though we had already dialogued about a lot of things, we were far from done covering other issues, so with us being neighbors, it just made things a lot easier. After covering all the things that we needed to go over, including a lot of the current events that were happening within the organization, DB basically reiterated the fact that he told my co-defendants to stop running their mouths about me. He said he gave them all an opportunity to produce paperwork, but none of them could, so he told them to shut the fuck up or they face repercussions. He then went through the business of advising me of my status, and then he apprised me of what he had done in regards to my investigation. He told me that I was on freeze, which I already knew, but that I wasn't considered no good. I would be acknowledged as a functioning C of that household, but that I would not be privy to any of the household's business and that no paperwork was to go through my hands. I was fine with that, as I was just glad to be amongst the collective on an active tier. But this policy was broken almost immediately. Whenever they had an investigation or something that was going on in the jail, DB would shoot me all the reports and he'd tell me to basically act as an advisor to him. Everything came through my hands. And I do mean everything. Reports, NA reports, rosters, investigations, IRs, etc., etc. I never said nothing, but I tripped on it and how open they continue to be with me. On one hand, I didn't understand why he was breaking policy the way he was. But on the other hand, it was inspiring to know that I was still being trusted by my people. Furthermore, he told me that he had an open line to Chuco and that he had been his neighbor in Pelican Bay. He told me that he told Chuco about my phone calls and that he made it clear that that was all it was, that it never went any further than that. He said he also told him my reasoning for doing it, that basically my wife was dying from lupus and that I was just trying to keep her pacified. He actually showed me Chuco's correspondence about everything so I'd feel confident in what he was telling me. Chuco basically said to just let me finish up my case and that they'd look into it themselves once I got up there. But for now, everything was good, and it just assured me that I was in good hands. The very next day, the floor officers came up on the tier and asked me, DB, and Thavo if we wanted to go out to the sun deck, which is basically the yard. I knew that this was going to be one of the defining moments, and that if something was going to go down, that this is when it would have happened. Outside on the sun deck, where we were out on the yard together. After all, classification had me classified as being on protective custody for the last 20 months, and this was the first time in a long time that I had physical contact with anyone in almost 2 years. When we were getting pulled out, I was the last one to get cuffed up, and I was behind the other two on our way out. Because I was the last one, this means I would have been the first to get my cuffs taken off when we made it out to the yard. I know this is going to sound real stupid, but this is how much my ego was involved at that time. I was so intent on proving that I wasn't a coward and that I wasn't scared to be out there with these guys that I did something for no other purpose than just to appease my ego. When we walked out on the sun deck, I would have been the first one to get my handcuffs taken off since I was the last one in line. But instead of racing to get my hands free, or instead of trying to get my cuffs taken off first, I purposely stepped away from the gate to let the other two get their cuffs off first. This was all ego, something I felt like I needed to prove, but it was actually a boneheaded mistake, because if DB and Thavo were going to try to hit me, they would have been able to cut my head off and I wouldn't have been able to do shit about it. That was a freebie. Obviously, the day went on uneventful and nothing happened. But even though I had gotten past this initial test, I wasn't about to let my guard down and just assume that things were all good just yet. There was always the possibility that they might not have wanted to do anything in front of the CO and that maybe they would have tried to sneak me later. So I continued to try to act normal, and we shot a few games of basketball, but I kept myself mentally prepared for the rest of the yard. I actually continued to maintain this mindset for the next 3 or 4 yards until I felt confident enough that nothing was happening. At least not at that time there wasn't. But being on freeze in that predicament, this could have changed at any given time. A letter, a visit, a filter brought by an NA into the jail with regard to a change or update on my status could have changed everything that fast. My ability to gauge a change in character, a change in demeanor, a change in normal routine, body language, eye contact, or any other small subtle differences would now be on full display and would now be dependent on whether or not I was able to detect anything. But this was something I prided myself in. I've been doing time all my life, so I studied these environments and became apt at detecting these changes, detecting a change in the climate or picking up something in the air that would alert me. People are creatures of habit. They habitually follow patterns, routines, and habits. That's in any facet of life. So when there's a change in the monotony or they break in routine, it usually means something's going on. For the next 17 months, I programmed with the collective on an active tier. I never tried to meddle into the household's business, nor did I ever try to involve myself in these affairs. I understood and respected my status as being on freeze, and this is something that I was completely okay with. But as time progressed and my influence began to proliferate amongst the Norteños in the old jail, they gradually began to open up and trust me. This wasn't by design. I wasn't trying to infiltrate. I didn't have to. I was just conducting myself the way that I usually do. In time, it was like I wasn't even on freeze. They had completely abandoned the protocols of how you interact with someone on freeze, DB included. Everything that was going on in the jail came through my hands. Reports, street business, investigations, rosters, etc., etc. Honestly, DB wasn't a good leader and didn't know how to navigate through a lot of the things that he was encountering. What started out as him turning to me as an advisor or as a means of giving him a second of opinion basically turned into me running the jail myself. Towards the middle part of 2007, DB was getting short to being released. He won his appeal and was within a few months of getting paroled. On one occasion, while DB, Thavo, and myself were on the yard, DB told me that he caught wind about Lorenzo Lancho Guzman running his mouth about me on the streets. In fact, he told me that Lancho and a few other C's out there were saying this, but that it was all being generated by Lancho. I knew how scandalous this dude was. He was a snake that always smiled in your face but talked shit behind your back. Needless to say, it didn't surprise me, but now I started wondering how things might play out if he ended up in the jail. This was something I had to prepare myself for. When DB started to get closer to his release date, I began to run hypothetical questions at him about things that I was anticipating in the future. Aside from the less trivial matters, such as who he was going to leave in charge when he departed and other things like that, the main thing I wanted clarification on was what was going to happen if Lancho or any of his supporters landed in the county jail. It wasn't so much Lancho himself that I was worried about. It was the fact that I was basically defenseless on freeze, that I'd be at his mercy if he was to pull up, and I wouldn't be in any position to defend myself. Even though I have some history with Lancho, it wasn't always good history. In fact, the majority of it was bad. For example, whenever we both end up in San Quentin on parole violations, I was the one who always kept him in check and never allowed him to abuse the Norteños. Nobody else had the authority to say anything to him, and the C's that did never had the backbone to put his ass in check. I stayed riding that fool's helmet because I knew how scandalous he was. Same thing on the streets. If he wasn't crying about getting the smaller bag or crying about why I was out there knocking people out who were being disrespectful, he found something else to cry about. This is how scandalous he was, and this is how he used to abuse his status over the Norteños that were there with him. So I established a hustle over there in San Quentin sometime between or around 1998 to 2000. This was when they still allowed inmates to smoke. I had an arrangement established with 4 or 5 different guys on death row where I'd give them so many books of stamps for pouches of tobacco. Condemned inmates were allowed to buy as many pouches of Bugler as they wanted. It was a win-win hustle for us as well as these guys on death row. We'd buy anywhere from 300 to 400 pouches of tobacco every month, and this was commensurate to money in prison. Tobacco bought you everything: food, canteen, jewelry, pills, stamps, etc., etc. Whatever kind of food or contraband was out there, tobacco was like money and was used to buy it. You could probably get anywhere from 50 to 60 rolled cigarettes out of a pouch, maybe even more. So when I started this hustle, I had 3 objectives. 1, to keep the household self-sustaining, self-solvent. 2, to keep all those homies smoking who smoked, and for those who didn't smoke, to give them a means to buy things like food or other things that they might find out there that they chose to buy. Giving them prison currency, so to speak, will give them this ability. And 3, to maintain control of the prison market and all the vital things including drugs that are critical to controlling the prison. So I had this set up, and it was something that continued to get pushed all the way up until they banned tobacco in all California prisons. During one of my parole violations, I landed back in C-section, which was basically the hole or administrative segregation. The first thing I noticed and hear is that the homeboys on the tier were over there selling their desserts and items out of their box lunches for cigarettes. When they sell cigarettes over there, they call them baseball bats. So all day you can hear it being yelled over the tier, "I got baseball bats on the line, where you at?" I couldn't believe that the homies were actually on the tier selling their shit. At the time, I didn't know nothing other than they just didn't have tobacco. But nonetheless, I put a stop to it. I told all the homeboys in C-section to stop selling their shit until I found out what was going on. I assumed that they'd either fucked off all the tobacco or they didn't have enough stamps to keep it going. But either way, I knew these guys on death row well enough to get a front if that's what we needed in order to get everything back on track. I knew Lancho was housed in East Block at that time, so I figured as soon as I made it out to the yard, I'd find out through him what was going on. So during my first yard out, I hit Lancho up and asked him why the homies in C-section are selling their food for tobacco. He tells me that they're given a certain amount for the week, and if they smoke it all up before the end of the week, then they're ass out. So I asked him how many cigarettes each of the homies are getting every week, and he tells me 14. 1 cigarette in the morning and 1 at night. It's fucking ridiculous, man. When I started this hustle, I was giving them anywhere from 8 to 10 a day, which was plenty for them to smoke, plus they had so many that they were required to sell for the house. This ensured that we always had enough to re-up and keep it going. When I asked Lancho how many pouches we had, he told me that there was 350 and that they were all in his cell. Because according to him, he had to maintain tight control over it and keep them on their quota. Classic Lancho, classic greedy ass Lancho. I couldn't believe this dude. He's smoking all day like a fucking train in his cell while the homies are going without. I told him that he needed to make sure that he had 250 pouches brought out for C-section during the following yard, and that he needed to spread out the other 150 in East Block. That I didn't want him keeping any more than 10 pouches in his cell at a time. That's how scandalous this dude was. I heard Convict's Perspective tell you guys a story about how NF member George Lucky Mendoza from San Jose was hit while Lancho was there. What they didn't tell you, because my name wasn't being mentioned at that time, was that I had just left and caught a bus to Corcoran. The only reason Lucky wasn't hit while I was there was because I gave him my word that I wouldn't allow or sanction it under any circumstances. I knew it was a bad call, that it was bullshit, and that it was all over personal issues, so I wouldn't allow it. Skip wanted Lucky hit because Lucky was involved with a female named Mommy who had been with Skip's boy, Pony Boy, 20 years earlier. Imagine that. So Skip wanted him hit because Pony Boy was one of his boys. I even told Lucky that I wasn't going to allow anything to happen to him while I was there, but that I couldn't promise him anything after I left. And sure enough, he was hit the same week I caught the bus to Corcoran. And if that wasn't bad enough, Lancho was so scandalous, he made sure that the hit was done while he was on a visit, as he didn't want to be out there on the yard while it was happening. So Lancho and I had a long history of bumping heads. These are only a few of the examples, but I basically knew that if he landed in that jail after DB left, that he was going to try to kick me while I was down, and of course while I was in a vulnerable position. This was something DB and I talked extensively about, and although he assured me that I'd be okay and that he had a plan in place, I just wasn't that confident about it and knew that it would become a problem. Sometime in the beginning of 2007, they moved all of us that were there housed in South Max to different parts of the jail. Some of us went to Second East, and then everybody else went to the 4th floor. They converted South Max to PC, so we were all moved. Second East was where everything ended up going all bad. It started while DB was still there. You would have thought these dudes would have learned something from the first wave of indictments when we all got indicted. But again, money took priority and all sense of discretion went out the window. Another NF member by the name of James Stick 'em Up Kramer landed in Second East with us. It wasn't even a full week of him being there on the tier with us that they were already on the phone trying to get all the money off the streets that people owed him. He got picked up on a parole violation and was only there for about 10 days before he caught a bus to Santa Rita. But while he was there, him and DB both had my neighbors Frank Manos Gutierrez and Luis Looney Rodriguez make all the phone calls to their contacts on the streets. They were smart enough not to do it themselves, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter because Looney and Manos were so sloppy that they ended up getting damn near the whole tier indicted anyway. Half the time when they made these calls, they were drunk off the wine I was making. I'll get to the wine in a minute, but the wine was actually instrumental in serving two very important purposes. It acted as sodium pentothal, truth serum, and it also loosened up these guys' tongues to the point to where there was nothing they didn't share with me. There were times when I would even hear Manos and Looney talking on the phone, and I would tell them that they were going to get themselves caught up the same way I did, but they just ignored my warnings. As far as the wine, I know everybody brags about knowing how to make it and that they make the best shit, but I seriously had it down to a science. I was making it once a week on Sundays during football season, but this caused the entire tier to lose focus of the concept of security at all levels. I'd have these dudes so drunk that they'd be laying on their stomachs in their cells with their arms poking out of their bars, holding empty cups, tapping them on the ground, begging me to send them another cup. Come on, B, I love you, brother. Send me another cup, carnal. And again, by this time, my influence hadn't only continued to proliferate amongst them, but I had actually gained the allegiance of each and every one of them individually to the point to where I had built an alliance around me. I worked on disarming each one of them individually, gradually building rapport up and down the tier. I had to. My ability to maneuver and jostle depended on how much loyalty I was able to win over. Towards the end of 2007, DB finally paroled and left the keys to the county jail with an NR member by the name of Steven Stretch Martinez. DB again tried assuring me that things would be okay, but Stretch was only an NR member and could only do so much to enforce DB's directives. Already Lancho was a foot up, and at the end of the day, there was really nothing Stretch could do. He could tell Lancho about DB's directives, but there was nothing beyond that he could do. It was NF business, and at some point, he would have been told this. Within a month of DB leaving, everything that I had anticipated happening began to happen. Lancho arrived at the jail with another NF member, Marco Huerta-Wabundis, and an NR member named Frank Joker Ruiz. I knew that he definitely had the backing of these two, so I basically knew that Stretch was going to be useless. He had good intentions, and Stretch even told me he'd do everything he could for me, but knowing how politics and the protocols worked, I knew that I was in a bad situation. During the first 2 months, Lancho landed in the jail. He was quiet, and I don't think he really pushed an agenda. But eventually he began sending word to see if we could get him moved down there to Second East with us. He wanted to get down there because Second East was probably the best max tier in the jail, and the 4th floor where he was at just wasn't the spot to be in. Stretch wanted to leave him where he was at. He kept telling me that he didn't think it was a good idea to bring him down because he said he'd start pushing an agenda against me. But I disagreed. I told him, let's bring him down here. Fuck all that. I'd rather have the dude right here on the tier with me where I could deal with him personally and where we wouldn't have to stay guessing what he was up to. I even told Stretch and some of the others down there with us that I could predict Lancho and that I knew exactly what he'd do. I told them that if he moved down there, he'd try to act like we were best friends and that he'd start sharing all household business with me. I said that because he was always emphasizing to them the importance of keeping me on freeze and not exposing me to anything. When we spoke to classification about moving Lancho down there with us, it was with another gang intel officer by the name of Dela Cruz. I told Dela Cruz that we wanted to move Guzman, aka Lancho, down there with us and that I wanted him as a celly. He said that he'd ask him if he wanted to move and that he'd try to get him down there the following week. I knew Lancho wouldn't move into my cell, not only because he was a coward, but I just wanted to expose him and pull his covers every way I could. A few days later, Dela Cruz walked the tier again and told us that he had asked Lancho if he wanted to move and if he wanted to cell up with me. He said Lancho was willing to move, but that he wanted his own cell because he had plans on having someone else move down there with him. I just laughed to myself and said, you fucking coward. What happened to it being mandatory to taking advantage of every opportunity to get access to someone like me, someone who might possibly end up becoming a target? I knew why Lancho refused the invite, but there was nothing I could do about it. And as much as I wanted to thump this chump, I was really hoping that things ended up working out for me. A few weeks later, classification ended up moving him down there to Second East with us. And as soon as he hit the tier, he almost immediately started doing all the things that I told him that he'd do. As he was being escorted past my cell, he stopped in front of my gate, smiled, extended a handcuffed hand, and said, "What's up, carnal? How you been, boy?" I just played along, shook his hand, and said, "What's going on, brother?" After we exchanged greetings, they continued to walk him down the tier to his cell. But the phoniness and the fraudulence of his character wasn't missed. As soon as he was down the tier, Looney and Manos knocked on my wall to signal acknowledgement that they caught how fake this cat was and that I was already right. I had been around Lancho enough to know exactly what he was going to do once he got down there. And it was like clockwork. Everything I said he was going to do, he did. I said he was going to come down there and act like we were best friends. Then I said he was going to start sharing all the household business with me. And I said he was going to start treating me like I wasn't even on freeze. Almost like he had my back and was supporting me. And it didn't take long either. That fool didn't even clean his cell before he told me to shoot a line down to him so I could check something out. When I sent my line down there to him and pulled it back in, I already knew what it was. He either wanted to get at me about household business in regards to something that was happening in the jail, or he wanted me to read something he brought from the 4th floor. When I pulled my line in and seen what it was, the first thing I did was scribble a message on a small piece of paper real quick, and then I sent it over to my neighbors, Manos and Looney, so they could see it with their own eyes. Lancho had basically sent me some reports about an ongoing investigation with regards to an NR member that was on the 4th floor. Here I am on freeze, the same dude he was calling the snitch on the streets, the same dude who he was asking everybody why I wasn't being hit. Now he's sending me hot paperwork. This dude's as fake as they come. After I finished reading the reports he sent me, I struck up a response giving him my opinion about it, and then I got into some of the issues that I wanted to confront him about. I asked him why he was out there telling people on the streets that I was telling, and why he felt like it was okay to spread that kind of propaganda about another C. Then I asked him what it was all based on, and if he was aware of the investigation that DB had conducted on me with the assistance of Chuco. Asking him if he was aware of Chuco's involvement was my way of putting him on notice that leadership was already aware of it. I had to make sure this fool knew. Putting all my confidence into what DB told me would have been reckless. Because although I'm sure he might have been trying to help me, no one's ever going to cover your ass like you would yourself. Normally, I would have gave Lancho some time to get situated and to clean his cell. But I knew he was a greasy ass dude, and I knew that hygiene definitely wasn't one of his strong suits. He just unrolled his mattress and unpacked his shit. I knew that's what he did because the tier was so quiet, I could hear what he was doing, and that he wasn't doing nothing over there. When I was done striking up the kite, I shot everything back down to him and waited to see what kind of bullshit he was going to try to come back with. I knew he was going to deny it, but I still wanted to see what he was going to say anyway. It didn't surprise me when he just responded openly over the tier, because besides being a grimy dude that walked around with mustard, peanut butter, and salad dressing stains all over his shirt, Lancho was also lazy. He didn't work out, he didn't like riding kites, and he very rarely participated in anything physical. Over the tier, he basically denied everything. He said, "Hey B, I didn't have nothing to do with that. That's not my business. And as far as I know, Chuco and them up there are already dealing with all that." Again, I knew this coward was lying, but I just played along with him and said, "I'm just telling you what I heard and what DB told me, bro." He said, "Nah, bro, that's bullshit. I never said nothing about any of that. I just let it go at that, but I knew the truth, and it was something I wouldn't forget." Over the next 5 or 6 months, Lancho got comfortable, and things basically ended up being similar to how they were when DB was there. Everything that went through Lancho's hands would later go through my hands. He started to use me as an advisor the same way DB did. DB's excuse was he was too stupid to run the household himself. Lancho's excuse was he was too lazy and too stupid to run the household himself. And again, the wine I made weekly became a critical factor. Over the course of time, Lancho also began making some of the same boneheaded mistakes that everyone else had made. He used Manos and Looney as conduits to try to collect some of the money that was left out there on the streets. All day these guys stayed on the phone making phone calls, networking with everyone out there who was active in the regiments. But Lancho would take it even a step further by continuing to orchestrate his street operations, thus getting every member in his crew caught up. Even though I couldn't stand this cat, I still tried warning him and the others that they were digging themselves into a deep hole. Again, my warning fell on deaf ears. Lancho was so stupid, I think he believed that since he wasn't the one communicating on the phone, that he was insulated. Second East consisted of 16 two-man cells and a shower in the middle. It was a good-sized tier, and although all the cells had double bunks in them, not everyone had a cellie. There was about 16 Norteños on that tier. And then there was about 6 or 7 Asian cats that were all part of the same case. There was so many of us on the tier, they split our yard programs up into about 3 or 4 different groups. On March 18, 2007, Classification Officer Delacruz came onto the tier and told me that he needed to pull me out about something. I asked him what it was about, and I basically told him that whatever it was, that he could tell me right there on the tier. I was done getting pulled out, only to find out that it was Livingston. So anytime they came to my cell to pull me out for something, I wanted to know what it was about. But Delacruz was adamant about pulling me out. He said, "What I need to tell you can't be said right here." I was just going to tell him to spin off and that I was good, but something about the way he was acting made me curious, so I ended up cuffing up. When we got downstairs, he sat me down, apologized for being the one to relay it, and then he told me that my wife had died the morning before. I'm not going to get into the details, it's all in my book, but I was devastated and it caught me completely off guard. A couple months later, Lancho's dumbass ended up getting the whole tier shook down, and things just ended up going all bad from there. At that time, there was an officer who used to look out for us. This guy would occasionally slide us a pouch of Bugler or a pack of cigarettes. I didn't smoke, but I used to spread it out amongst the other homies who did smoke so they could occasionally get their smoke on. One day, Lancho called down to me and asked if I thought it was a good time for him to spark one up real quick. I told him no, that the nurse was about to do her evening walk and to just wait until after she was done. This dumbass decided not to wait and lit it up anyway. His brain told him that he still had enough time, so that's what he did. Fucking dummy. As soon as he was done, the front gate was keyed open and the floor officer escorted the nurse on the tier. I knew it was all bad as soon as I looked through the crack of my door and seen the expression on the CO's face. I could tell he smelled something as I was watching him inhale while looking up and down the tier. The other part about this that was all bad is that I had just sent everyone their issue of wine, and most of the homies had already started drinking. As expected, 20 minutes later, the front gate was keyed open and about 30 to 40 COs came onto the tier yelling shakedown. This idiot got the whole tier shook down because of his ignorance, his impatience, and all because he couldn't wait another 5 minutes to take a couple drags off a cigarette. Nobody cuffed up right away. I had just sent them all their issue of wine, so everybody was standing there in their cells drinking all their wine in front of the COs, including me. It had only been about a week since Vicky passed away, and I was still in a bad place. After I slammed down about 3 tumblers of some liquid death, I finally turned around, let them handcuff me, and then I was escorted into an empty chow hall with everyone else while they tore ourselves up. I remember looking around in the chow hall at all the other homies that day, and it was obvious that everyone in there was faded. These cats were drunk. In fact, Looney was so drunk that they cuffed him up to one of the tables, and then he fell backwards off the chair and couldn't get up because of the way the chains were cuffed to the seat. So he just laid there on the floor while everybody else laughed at his dumb ass. When they initially pulled me out, I had asked one of the COs to loosen my handcuffs because they were too tight. But an hour later, while I was still in the chow hall, nobody came back to loosen them. This had me livid. The more time that passed, the madder I got. And like I said, I was still in a funk about the loss of Vicky, so I was looking for reasons to start confrontations. When they finished tearing up our cells, about an hour and a half later, they came into the chow hall and started running everybody back one cell at a time. I asked how come nobody came back to loosen my cuffs, and because I couldn't get an answer from nobody, all my anger was starting to build up towards the sergeant. When it was finally my turn to get escorted back to my cell, I was walking out of the chow hall and got to a point in the hallway where the sergeant was posted up, just kind of standing there watching everybody get escorted. As I approached him, I stopped in front of him and I said, You motherfuckers better stop fucking with my property. This is the second time this week you motherfuckers been back there fucking around. And you're gonna get the kind of reaction you're not ready for. He just stood there and acted like I was invisible. As I started to walk away, the further I got, the more upset I got. I don't think it was the fact that they had already searched us the week prior to that made me mad. I think it was the fact that the sergeant didn't say anything and ignored me that really upset me. The more I thought about it, the madder I got. At first I was just gonna let it go. I wasn't even gonna waste my time with it. But then I said, fuck it. I gotta get this shit off my chest. So I turned around and started walking back towards him. When I got within 10 feet, I bull rushed him and tried to headbutt him. Honestly, I only made it about halfway there before I was dogpiled by about 10 COs. Once again, I was walked backwards to the elevator, given a lightweight elevator ride, and then I was taken downstairs to one of their ice boxes for the next 3 or 4 hours. However, this time, when it came to taking me back to my cell, instead of going back to 2nd East, they put me back in an observation cell up in 3rd East. This was the 3rd time I had been in this particular observation cell during the 4 years I had been there. I stayed housed in this cell for about 3 months before I was eventually moved back down to 2nd East. But during the time I was up there, something interesting happened. One of the classification officers came to my door one day and handed me a letter. He said, "Go ahead and read this. I thought you might want to check it out." The letter was a correspondence from Lancho to Chuco. Although it was a feeble attempt at writing in code, Lancho was about as dumb as a doorknob, so the message was clear. Lancho was telling Chuco that he had paperwork in hand confirming that I was cooperating. He didn't specify what the paperwork was, but since I knew that no paperwork existed, I assumed that he was just flat out lying, being deceptive and straight up giving Chuco bad information. Needless to say, I was upset. I wanted to confront Lancho and ask him why the fuck he was lying to Chuco, but this officer was just giving me a heads up and I couldn't tell anyone that he had exposed that to me. He then asked me what I wanted to do and I told him to move me back down to 2nd East, where everyone else was at. That I had to deal with this directly and that the longer I waited, the worse that this was gonna get. He told me that his sergeant would never allow this and that the only thing he might agree to is to move me back to 2nd East and to move Lancho and his minions back to the 4th floor. I honestly thought that this was gonna look super suspicious and that it would only make Lancho push harder. Especially once he found out that I was back in 2nd East. This was the other thing. The night I got moved for bull rushing the sergeant, my whole support base was also moved to the 4th floor. Looney, Mono, Stretch, and Bones were all moved to the 4th floor the same night that I was moved because they all boarded up. Boarded up means to cover up the front of your cell so you can't be seen and forcing the COs to extract you. They were all moved because they came together and supported me due to the way I was jumped on and moved the night we were all drinking. Of course, Lancho was the only one who didn't get involved, so he was the only one who wasn't moved. After the others were moved, he managed to convince classification to move his biggest supporters, Weddle and Joker, down there with him. So now this officer basically wanted to move Lancho, Weddle, and Joker back to the 4th floor, and in turn, he wanted to move Stretch, Monos, Looney, Bones, and myself back to 2nd East. That same night, this officer put all the moves in, and by shift change, we were all shuffled around in the jail. It didn't take long for Lancho to start chirping and throwing a fit about it either. He was actually upset that they were all moved and suggested that Stretch and some of the others try to get moved back so Lancho could move into their cells. This was ridiculous. Over the next couple of weeks, Lancho began sending filters down to 2nd East, putting Stretch, Monos, Looney, and Bones all on freeze due to their actions on the night that they boarded up. This was just an excuse to isolate my support base and to basically find a way to take away their power. Stretch was not only put on freeze, but he was also stripped of his position. The funny thing about all this was that Lancho didn't start implementing any of this until he was moved. It seemed like this just put him on a rampage and that it caused him to throw a big temper tantrum. During one of my first yards out, I went out to the yard with Looney and Monos and found out more about what Lancho was up to. They told me that they wanted to tell me something, but that I had to keep it strictly to myself because it could get them both hit. After I gave them both my word and swore up and down that I wouldn't say anything, this is what they told me. They said, "B, you're our boy. We don't give a fuck about what kind of propaganda Lancho and the others are putting out there about you, and most of us are supporting you. but Lancho's already been filtering it out that you're no good and that you're an informant. I swear to God, I felt numb. I felt like everything that I had worked for over the last 4 years was being sabotaged. I asked Looney and Manos what was making him say this and what was he basing it on if there was no police reports. Then they showed me a kite Lancho had someone strike up for the purpose of filtering it down to Second East. It confirmed that they were all on freeze, and it also confirmed that Stretch was not only being stripped of the position DB had delegated to him, but it also requested that Stretch do whatever he had to do in order to get to the 4th floor, even if this meant assaulting a CO. It then went on to admonish and warn each and every one of them that their continued support of me would result in them being deemed no good. Even though Looney and Manos were adamant about me keeping this between us, it was almost too much to bear. This was my career. I wasn't trying to get anyone else caught up, but it was obvious that this chump Lancho was cinching down on my status and that he was gunning for me. That same week that Looney and Manos shared this information with me, 2 things happened that changed the dynamics of everything. Damn near everyone on the tier was called to court and indicted due to all the messy phone calls that both Lancho and DB had Manos and Looney make over the last year. Because names were mentioned, PFN numbers were recited, or because different homeboys back there jumped on the phone, they were all indicted. The ugly part about it was that even some of their wives and girlfriends got indicted with them. Lancho's wife, Debbie Corrales, was also an instrumental part of these indictments, as she was convinced to cooperate after the cops threatened to take her kids. Whoever Lancho didn't get caught up, his wife did the honors, and she was a natural. She set up everyone who was either involved with the regiment or everyone who was an associate. That same week they were indicted, DB was also picked back up and moved right back down there with us to Second East. Because of everything that was going on with the indictments and because of what Looney and Manos had just told me about Lancho, I was making plans to plead guilty and to take the 185 to life that I was facing. My wife had just died. Then soon after that, my mom and grandmother died. So I was ready to get the fuck out of that county jail and just get on with going to prison. That same week, I had my attorney reach out to Athomi's attorney so that they could set a court date and work it out with the district attorney. We had put a formal offer on the table to the district attorney in an effort to resolve our case. Athomi and myself were the last 2 defendants on our indictment. Everybody else had either pleaded out or had their cases resolved. The offer my attorney put on the table to the district attorney was simple. I'd plead guilty to 185 to life in exchange for them to drop the life sentence on Athomi. He was going to plead out to 12 to 14 years, but with his credit, he would have walked out of the courtroom that same day. But Lancho found a way to sabotage all this and ended up not only fucking off Athomi's deal, but he created a worse situation across the board. The same week all this was going on, we got called out for our weekly yard Sundeck program, just like we did every other week. I was the first one to get pulled out. 4 other homeboys were getting cuffed up to go out to the yard with me when everything changed just that fast. As I walked out on the tier and coincidentally just so happened to stop in front of cell 208, which was occupied by Spanky and Pistolas, I seen something out of my peripheral that made me turn and look towards that cell. When I first looked at Spanky, I seen him standing on his gate with his channel changer protruding through the bars, and he was making jabbing motions, like he was trying to poke someone. At first I thought he was playing, and it just didn't register. But then I seen that he had a serious look on his face and realized that this fool was acting like he was trying to spear me. His contraption was about a foot too short, and I don't even think it had a tip on it. But just as with Pony the Phone Slayer, I kicked his tray slot shut and said a few choice words to him, while the CO tried to escort me off the tier. I couldn't believe it. First with the phone, and now with the channel changer. Despite the fact that the CO was trying to escort me off the tier, I walked around him and looked into each one of the homeboys' cells. I said, for real? You guys know you're wrong. You guys really think this shit's right? I can't believe it, man. It's bad enough I can't trust my enemies, but I see now I can't even trust my own people. Nobody said nothing to me. Nobody would even look at me. I was tight with a lot of the homeboys on that tier, and later, most of them would end up cooperating and checking out. They'd later tell me that none of them wanted to do that night, but that they were just complying with Lancho's directive. He told them that if they didn't hit me, that they'd all be deemed. When I took that walk of shame and I walked off the tier that night, I knew in my heart that it was over. As loyal as I had been trying to be over the last 5 years, I knew that I could never give my back in good faith to them again. Later, I'd also find out how scandalous Lancho really was. He was successful in getting Chuco to sanction a green light on me, but only after misleading him. I told you guys that Chuco was well aware of what was involved in regards to my phone calls because DB had submitted a full report on this. But this is how dirty Lancho is. This is how dirty NF politics had become. Lancho sent Chuco a letter / correspondence after he was moved to the 4th floor from 2nd East. The letter was written to mislead Chuco, period. He told Chuco that he now had paperwork in hand that confirmed I was an informant and that I was cooperating with law enforcement. Furthermore, he led Chuco to believe that he was in possession of some new police reports or some court transcripts or something else new that Chuco wasn't aware of, as if it was something new. But Lancho was referring to the phone calls that were now transcribed on paper. Had he told Chuco he was referring to the phone calls, Chuco would have told him that they were already aware of that. But of course, Lancho didn't clarify this. This would all come out later, and this also got Lancho in hot water. Regardless of what would become of me, he still misled leadership about the details of this investigation, and this would follow him. When I walked off the tier that night, they housed me back in the observation cell on 3rd West, or 3rd East. This was the second time that the NF had dropped the hammer on me, but this time it was different. This time there was no doubt in my mind that leadership was involved and that the green light had come from Chuco. That same night that this incident happened, I'm sure the gang intel unit at the county jail called SCC-SCT and Livingston because Livingston didn't waste any time in coming up to the jail to pull me out. Again, as he had done so many times in the past before, he propositioned me about cooperating and attempted to play on the fact that this was the second time that the NF had pulled the trigger on me. He emphasized that they had done it despite the fact that I wasn't cooperating and that there was no police reports. That I needed to realize that they were willing to write me off at such meager standards and that there was no more honor in this. I told Livingston that I needed to get my thoughts in order and that I needed at least a week to think about everything. That at this point, I just wasn't willing to start making those kinds of decisions. Now, in closing this up, here's what I want you guys to think about. Or for the purpose of putting yourself in the moment, think about this. Say this were you. You've been in the county jail fighting this case for close to 5 years. And during this 5 years, you've been faced with some of the same type of adversity that I was. Because of your past criminal history, you're looking at 185 to life under the 3-strike law. Now, just a few days before this, you agreed to plead guilty to the 185 to life top because you were trying to help your co-defendant get his life sentence dropped, and just because you were to the point where you just wanted to get the fuck out of that county jail. Taking the case to trial would have been a wash. There's overwhelming evidence against you, and with the informants who were lining up to testify, you knew you didn't stand a chance at trial. Then these idiots attempt to spear you, and all the dynamics changed that fast. So now, whether you want to come to terms with it or not, you're left with 2 choices. You either hold your mud, go to trial, take the 185 to life on the chin, get warehoused in Pelican Bay for the rest of your life, and then be looked as a piece of shit no matter what you do. Or you compromise your integrity, sell your soul, do what you have to do in order to help yourself, put all your confidence into the process, and be looked at as a piece of shit. Either way, it doesn't matter. No matter what you decide to do, your name and your legacy has already been destroyed. Period. Even if you take the life case, you're still going to be looked at as a snitch and as a piece of shit. So what choice would you have made? You only have 2 choices. To some people, I'm sure they would agree that although one choice might be without honor, it's the wisest choice considering the circumstances. And then on the flip side, I'm sure that people would also agree that the other choice might be considered somewhat an honorable choice. It doesn't seem like the smartest of the 2. I'm just curious what some of you would have done. It's too easy to answer it by saying, I don't know. So if you don't want to answer that question, that's fine. I know what most of you would have done, whether you admit it or not. When you're in a situation like this, where your life is literally hanging in the balance, and you're faced with this type of adversity, self-preservation kicks in and reality has a way of shaking you loose. We only have one shot at life. We live one time, and if you drop the ball and make the wrong choice, there is no do-overs. That's it. There were a total of 4 indictments that took place between 2004 and 2011. A lot of the people involved were considered some of the solidest people in San Jose. A lot of them did what most people do before they knew they were going to be indicted. They talked shit and they criticized those that decided to help themselves. But once they were indicted themselves, and once they were exposed to some of the same adversity, they themselves fell and decided to help themselves too. The lesson in this is, don't criticize or talk shit about other people that have made whatever decisions they've made for themselves, because you're not the one walking in their shoes. Almost 300 people were indicted or were charged in other cases related to these investigations, and almost 80%, approximately 240 of them, ultimately cooperated. Those are huge numbers. Another 10% of those didn't cooperate, only did so because there were no offers and there was nothing that they could have done to help themselves. I've never tried to justify or defend anything that I've had to do in order to get to where I am today. If you ask me, I'll tell you how I really feel about it. I'll tell you that some of my beliefs have never changed and that I don't think it's okay. That it's bad business and that it's something you can't pretty up or make look good. Sometimes in life, you have to make some of the less desirable decisions because they just make more sense. It doesn't mean it's right, it's just smarter. I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on these things, and it's not something that I continue to try to rationalize in my mind. It is what it is. In some ways, I'm glad Lancho pushed an agenda on me, and I'm glad some people chose not to give me the benefit of the doubt. Otherwise, I'd be doing life right now, and I wouldn't be here telling you guys about my shortcomings. Am I in a better place? Of course. Do I wish some things could have been different? Of course I do. I'm sure we all have regrets, and I'm sure we all live with things that we wish wouldn't have happened. That's just the way it is. For those of you who don't know, Lancho was sentenced to 46 years and was deemed no good not long after he was convicted. Karma came back and didn't forget him. Lancho may have been successful in sabotaging my status with his deceptive politicking, but that's okay, because at the end of the day, I think I won and he lost. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. Thank all of you who have continued to support our channel, and our next project should be dropping soon.